Okay, ready to get started. Doing all right this week? Oh, very good. So what did we do last week? We got through most of the rest of the helpers that we needed to talk about in our lightsabers example. Went through all the different helpers we needed to be able to create our forms for the lightsabers, which were pretty simple. There are certainly a lot of other helper methods for forms that we didn't cover, like, for example, the one for creating a drop-down list to select component. They're all covered real well in the documentation, though, so I didn't ever feel like we needed to go through every single one of them. They're all out there, and you can find examples of them pretty easily, right? I think what we're ready to start talking about today is drying up our code a little bit. There were a number of different places in our lightsaber example where we essentially had some duplicate code. Probably most notably in our edit and our new pages. Those two pages are 99% identical. The only thing that's different between them is the heading up at the top and the links that we show down at the bottom. That's really the only difference between those two. So a lot of drying up to do there. One other place where we had a little bit of drying up to do is in our show page. We had a little bit of logic in here that determined whether an image of a lightsaber would be shown. And we had something very similar to that over on our index page. We didn't write them in exactly the same way, but the basic functionality is the same. Show a lightsaber if we, or show an image of a lightsaber if we have one. If we don't have one, then don't show it, is really what both of those kind of come down to. Right? So what I wanted to do today was I wanted to show you two different features that Rails has built into it that makes it easy for us to reuse code that we have. Right? The first one is that we have the ability to create our own helpers. We've been spending a lot of time talking about helpers that are built into Rails. Helpers that let us create image tags, helpers that let us make links, helpers that help us build parts of forms, helpers to manipulate text, helpers out the years. We got tons and tons of helpers in Rails. But of course, Rails doesn't come with every single helper that one could potentially need. For example, Rails does not have a helper that lets us decide whether to display an image of a lightsaber or not. I think it was a mistake, them not including that. I can't imagine how they didn't think that was a pretty core feature that every application was probably going to need to use. But one way or another, they never actually put that in. So what they did instead was they gave us the ability to be able to create our own helpers. Right? If you look under the app directory in a Rails project, right, there's of course the directories for the assets, for the controllers, for the views, for the models that we've all talked about a little bit. But there's also a helpers directory there. Right? And inside the helpers directory, what you typically find is you'll find Ruby files, just plain old .rb files. Right? And usually one is created for the application as a whole, the application helper. And you typically also then have a helper file for each of your separate controller model pairs. So since we have a lightsabers controller, we also have a lightsabers helper file. Right? If you take a look at that helper file, oh look, I already have something in it. I guess I forgot to wipe that out when I was cleaning up this project. It's already written for us. Right? Typically when you first start up the helper, it's a module. It's just an empty module, so it would look something like this. It would just be module lightsabers helper. Right? And essentially what we can do is we can write our own methods inside these helpers, and the methods we write are then available to us in our views. So anytime we're working in a view and we wish there was a simple method we could call to do some work for us, all we have to do is create that method in the helper file, and that method will be available for us. Right? So for example, here in the lightsabers helper, I already have a method in here called display for displaying a lightsaber. We tell it what lightsaber we want to display, we tell it what width we want the image to be, and what happens is the display method checks to see if there actually is an image for that lightsaber, and if there is, it then uses the image tag helper to actually create an image tag for that particular lightsaber's image with whatever width it is we specified. Right? That value actually gets returned from the method, right? The image from the, output from the image tag helper. So whenever we call this method, it will either output nothing if there is no lightsaber, or it will return the HTML code to create an image tag. Right? So we can make use of that, for example, over on our index page. on our index page where we have this little bit of logic in here to decide whether to display the lightsaber image or not. What we could do instead is we could wipe that out, and in its place we could just say display, that's the name of our helper, pass it the arguments that it requires. So it needs to know the lightsaber, and it needs to know the width. And then when this page is rendered, what will happen is we'll call our display method from our helper file. We pass it the lightsaber we're wanting to display the image for and its width. The display method gets called. It'll check to see if that lightsaber actually has an image. If it does, we get the image tag spit back out with the appropriate width. Of course, if that lightsaber didn't have an image, nothing will print. So a little bit cleaner, not having to have that logic in there. If we take a look, it seems to work. I've got lightsabers for all of them except for blah down at the bottom. And I didn't get a broken image tag for it. I could use that exact same helper then over on my show page. Right here, I'm wanting to display a lightsaber image. So instead of, again, repeating that same basic logic, I could again just use my helper. I could say display at lightsaber, which is where the model is this time. For the width this time, I don't know, I'll say 400. I don't know how big those images actually are. 400 should be good. Okay. If I click on a lightsaber now, the image shows up if the image is available. If I click on a lightsaber that doesn't have an image available, no image shows up. So it looks like it's working fine. So by taking that little repeated bit of functionality that we were needing and moving it over into a helpers file, turning it into just a simple little Ruby method essentially, makes it a lot more convenient to use. We can create as many of these different little helper methods as we might happen to need. So they can be pretty convenient. Whenever the logic for something that you want to do gets a little cumbersome, especially to have it over in the views, kind of intermixed with the HTML and everything else that's going on. Or if it's something that's done in multiple places, a lot of times putting it into a helper method is a much cleaner way to go. Easy enough? Yeah. Okay. The other little trick that Rails gives us that lets us clean up duplicate code is the use of what they call partials. Partial is basically just a file. Whenever you create a partial file names always have to begin with an underscore. And what happens is a partial is basically like a page fragment. Whenever we have a piece of code that's repeated on multiple pages or multiple times on the same page, what we can do is we can take that repeated little bit of code and put it into one of these partial files, and then we can just ask Rails at any time, at any place, to drop that partial in for us, kind of like doing an import in a way, or an include of some sort. So a real obvious place where we could use that is on our edit and our new page, where the two pages are virtually identical. What we could do on those is if I essentially take my entire form, top to bottom, and cut it out, so on my edit page I'm left with just the heading at the top and the links at the bottom. What I'm going to do is inside my lightsabers folder then, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it _form.html.erb. So since it's a partial, it starts with an underscore. And then all that code I copied out of my, or cut out of my edit page, I'm just going to drop it there into my partial. I change that word to saved right there. Now, so now that form and the error displaying code above it is saved sort of independently of the actual pages that need it. Right? Back over on the edit page, what I can do now is I can use the render method. Right? Rails provides this render method. It's really quite powerful. You can use it in a lot of places for a lot of different things. But certainly one of the easiest things you can use it for is to display partials. So if I, for example, just say render form, Kind of strange, whenever you ask render to display a partial, despite the fact that the file name always starts with an underscore, you do not include the underscore when you pass it to render. Render knows that if we ask for a page called form, that the actual file name will be underscore form. It puts the underscore on there essentially automatically. We don't put it anywhere except when we actually save the file. If I go over and I take a look at my update page, my edit page, the form is there. Looks like it's even working correctly. If I go over to my new page then, and again, like I did on the edit page, chop out everything except for the heading at the top and the link at the bottom, and instead put in render form. When I go to the new page, it's there. Looks like it's working fine. So the edit and the new page are now sharing that partial. Both of them are using that same form partial. So if we ever needed to make any kind of update to that form, now we only have to do it in this one place. Make it here in the partial, and we'll immediately see that change reflected in both the edit and the new page. So nice and easy. Nice and easy. Okay. All right. When we said to render the form, we didn't have to provide a path of any sort because the form we were referring to in that case was in the same directory as the two views that were rendering it. So the edit page, the new page, and the partial they were accessing, form, are all located in the same location, so we didn't have to tell it where to find it. You can actually create partials and put them into other directories, other places, if you happen to need to. For example, if this application ballooned out and not only did we keep track of lightsabers, but we kept track of Jedi and Sith, and as a result, instead of under views there only being a lightsabers directory, we would also have a Jedi directory and a Sith directory and so on and so forth. If there was some sort of shared partial that we wanted to be able to access from all of them, then that's perfectly acceptable. We could do that. The way I usually do it is under views. I'll create a new folder there, call it shared. And then I could create a partial there in that shared directory and still access it from all of the others. Just as an example, say our search form. Maybe I wanted to be able to do my lightsaber search from any page. I could take the actual search form for the lightsaber there. I'm going to cut it out of the search page. Oops. There we go. And under that shared directory I created, I'm going to make a new file there. I'm going to call it _search .html.erb. I'll paste my form into that new partial. If I go back over to the actual search page then, if I were to say render search, if I go to my search page, I get an error. It says missing partial lightsaber search. Essentially what it's doing, because I didn't say otherwise, is it's looking for a search partial inside the lightsabers directory. But I didn't put the partial in the lightsabers directory. I put it off in a separate directory so that it could potentially be used by other parts as well. So all I really need to do is tell it where to find it. So my render statement on the search page, if I say render shared /search, telling it to go to the shared directory, then it still doesn't work.
Mine worked just fine.
Did it really?
Shared, yeah.
Oh, I see. I didn't end up putting it in shared. I ended up putting it in my views directory. Let me move that. Is it there? Come on, you move. Don't want to move, huh? All right, let me do it the hard way. By hard way, I mean the way that actually works. Let's see, lightsabers, app, views. See, this is where I messed up. I put search here in the views directory. It should be over here in shared. There we go. There, now it's working again. Now, where was yours?
Mine worked with just search on there.
With just search, and you put it in the shared directory? That's wrong. That shouldn't work. Excuse me. On your search page, you cut the form out and you put in the render statement? No, I tried it a second ago and it died. Something funny there. I wonder if your browser maybe has a cached copy. You try quitting and firing it up again and see if that makes a difference. Weird. Okay, I gotta look.
Oh wait, mine's in views,
Oh, okay.
but it's still working though.
Okay, and you just said render search? Yeah, but if you said render shared search, that's when it should die. Should.
It's in shared. Even using just search work. It's weird.
Yeah, definitely shouldn't be working. Alright. Well, as long as you know that it shouldn't. Something's making it work. Something mysterious. But it shouldn't. It shouldn't be working. Yeah, okay. Once we have search out of there as a partial, there is the possibility at that point that we could actually go in and add search to other pages. Like if we wanted to be able to search from our show page, for example. I could, up at the top of my show page, drop in the render for my search form. So if I were to go to the show page for one of my lightsabers now, I have my search form up at the top of it, which I didn't have before. So if I then search, it goes ahead and does the search, taking me back over to the index page to display the results. Probably be better if I had put that under that header. Yeah, something like that. So I could search from any page now. Right? Without having to repeat the code. I could just drop that search form in wherever I happen to need it. And since it's not specifically under the lightsabers directory, it would even be available if I had other controllers, other sets of views for Jedi or for Sith or for spaceships or whatever.
It's not showing up.
It's not showing up at all. Ah, your curse.
Oh god. It's in shared. the search for? No.
Sure. Okay, there. That explains it. There you go. Ah, there.
Okay.
Okay.
That solves the other thing too.
Yeah, that explains why things weren't changing. Okay, good. All right. Let's see. All right. Did you have any questions? Everything making some sense?
Yeah.
That's good. All right. Rails has some special little tricks that it can pull concerning partials and rendering. One of them is that if you create a partial that has the same name as the model that goes along with the view, Rails can find it automatically, essentially. So, for example, over on our index page, if we wanted to say that the way you display a lightsaber is something in particular, maybe instead of displaying it as a table, for example, on our index page, we wanted to display it in a slightly fancier way. We could, of course, just put that fancier code right here into the index page itself. But if that fancier way of displaying a lightsaber was maybe something that we also wanted to be able to use on other pages, then it would make sense to take that and put it into a partial. So let's say we want to go ahead and create another new file. Right? And I'm going to name it specifically underscore lightsaber singular .html.erb underscore lightsaber.html.erb. Right? And because of that particular name, what will happen is we'll actually get the benefit of a little shortcut we can do with the render method that will automatically match it up with that particular partial because that partial's name matches the name of our model, lightsaber. Right? So let's do, let's see, how do I have this set up in the CSS? I'm going to do a div with a class. I'm going to set the class to lightsaber. And then I'm also going to put in the class the word dark side if the lightsaber's dark side value is true. Let's see, I'll put the image of the lightsaber next so we can use our display helper. I'll say display the lightsaber 300 pixels. Then maybe I'll put in an H2. In the H2, let's do a link to the lightsaber's name. And to link to it, we could just say lightsaber. I'll put in a paragraph that has the lightsaber's description. And then another paragraph, and we could put in our edit, our destroy links. We never did a destroy link, did we? We could go ahead and put that in too. So let's do link to edit. Edit lightsaber path. Missed something in there. Let me also then do a link to destroy. For this one, for the destroy link, it's a little strange. I tell it the lightsaber I want to destroy, and I have to tell it the method that I want it to use is delete. basically this request, when I click on the destroy link, it's going to be sent, instead of as a get request, it'll be sent as a delete request, which the Rails router and controller will pick up and interpret as meaning we want to destroy that particular lightsaber. All right, so that's my little partial, my lightsaber partial. Oh yeah, one other little thing I can throw in there. If I say confirm, are you sure? It'll automatically throw in the JavaScript, so a confirmation box pops up and asks if I actually want to destroy the lightsaber or not. Won't destroy it unless I confirm. Okay. All right, to use this partial then, back over on my index page, instead of this table that I've been using, I'm going to wipe out the table. Just keep my loop that I have here that goes through all the lightsabers. And inside the loop, I'm just going to say render the lightsaber. I don't even tell it the name of a partial. I just say render the lightsaber. Lightsaber being this variable that's being yielded here to this block from the each iterator. What Rails should then do is it should match up the fact that this particular active record model is a lightsaber object. And since I didn't tell it specifically the name of the file to use, it will automatically look for a partial called lightsaber. Same name. There we go. Different view. Not exceptionally well put together, but basic ideas there. Yours is what?
Can you go to your partial?
Sure. There it is.
Mine show up. They don't show up like yours do, but different squares. But I got everything else though.
Your div class up at the top, you have a lightsaber, a space, and then dark side of lightsaber.darkside. Got the space in there. That ought to, more than anything else, control how it's displayed. Everything look right?
Yeah, everything looks exactly the same.
First with CSS.
Next page looks right.
Yeah, it's like it's just not applying CSS right. I never tried that CSS. Possible. I'm not running mine in Safari. I didn't cross-browser test my CSS, so it's that might just be my embed CSS. Because it did look like it was doing part of it. The lips looked about right. The layout looked about right. Oh well. Something about that CSS again.
Gotta remember not to ask you to do any design projects for homework. Boy, yeah. Okay. What actually happened here, is on the index page, whenever we said render lightsaber, Rails automatically figured out that what was being rendered was a lightsaber. The fact that I called it lightsaber is kind of a coincidence. If I just said the variable's name is Saber, that's fine. That shouldn't break anything. Still works just fine. Rails is actually looking inside the actual model itself to determine what type of object it is. And based on what type of object it is, it automatically knows what the name of the partial for it should be. So the underscore lightsaber partial ends up being used, right? Despite the fact that I named it Saber here, over in the actual partial itself, the object that we're given to use, lightsaber, is based on the actual type of object it is. You see how I changed the name? Instead of calling it lightsaber there in the loop, I just called it Saber, right? And the name that I actually use at that point is insignificant next to the power of the Force. Well, it's insignificant in that Rails goes ahead and still knows that it's a lightsaber, and thus inside the partial still refers to it as a lightsaber.
So if you leave it Saber, it should render the page?
Say it again?
If you go back to the web page, it'll show up correct?
Yeah, it still works exactly the same way it did before. Not for you? Are we both working in Rails? The same Rails?
Yeah. Went through render Saber. And it said...
Wait, go back. Saber there too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Okay, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so the name of the variable we use when we trigger the render, right, doesn't make any difference, doesn't change what the actual name of the variable is inside the partial itself. Right? Yeah. All right, so that's one of the little shortcut tricks with render that Rails gives us. Right? Simply tell it to render a model. It'll always look for a partial whose name is the same as the model. Okay. We can also do the same thing with a pluralized form. If we were to make another partial, and I call it underscore lightsabers, plural, HTMLERB. So the plural form of the model name. Then what will actually happen there is it will expect for an entire relation, like an array, of those types of objects to be given. So I could do something like, say, is it at? I don't think it is. Lightsabers each do saber. I could take this little piece and put it into the plural form of the partial, the lightsabers partial. Back over on my index page then, if I wipe out the loop, the iterator, and I just say render my lightsabers, all of them, it should still work. Any difference? So everything's okay? Not okay. So yeah, in the index page, render at lightsabers. Okay, got it. Right. So basically the thing is with render, if we pass it a collection of an object, like a collection of lightsabers, it automatically recognizes that it's a collection, automatically figures out that it's lightsabers, and automatically then goes and looks for a partial called underscore lightsabers, plural. Right? If we say render and we just give it a model, a single instance of a model, right, render will automatically figure out what type of model that is and look for a partial with that name. So in this case, lightsaber. So what we've worked our way into is in our index page, we say, render this whole collection of lightsabers. And render says, sure, I can do that. It automatically then iterates through all of them in the lightsabers partial. And inside that, it says, render each lightsaber, and again, render says, yeah, sure, I can do that. I can figure that out. So it uses the lightsaber singular partial. So it can be a bit of a convenience. Oh, did our destroy link work? Hit cancel, it doesn't destroy. Hit OK, it does. Should anyway.
Can you go back to the underscore lightsaber partial?
The singular
Yeah.
with the destroy link?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there it is.
Link searches. Or it shows.
You sure you have the method delete in there? Lightsaber, confirm. Commas all in the right places. Delete's in there as a symbol.
Is the path for show and for delete are the same? The only difference is the method that's used. It's not making it. Try taking out the confirm. It also has a confirm. Put the letter X in it. Just to be sure. Inspect. Try exiting out of the screen there. CSYS block or something like it. CSYS block it. Same mechanism.
need CSS in my assignments.
Yeah. JavaScript's going to give you trouble too.
So, I guess we can confirm that the JavaScript is running. If you go back to your lightsabers.js.conf file, yeah, that. Excuse me. Let's see. Do dollar set of parentheses. Inside the parentheses, put in document as a method after the parenthesis dot. Not after the parenthesis dot ready. Then do an arrow after ready. Enter. Tab key once. And do alert space and put a set of quotes and say ready or something. Yeah, give that a try. Save that. Now you should see an alert pop up every time you refresh a page. Let's look at your layout file. Back to the browser. Let's just be the source of the page. Yeah. Scroll over to the section so we can see that. CSS. Yeah, it's only volume 1. Should be 2
To really keep CSS in the JS.
Should be application CSS and lightsaber CSS.
You don't have that application.
Yeah. That's it. Click on the JavaScript. It's never actually executed.
Is that supposed to be there? It's a simple one?
It's not. It looks like it's never actually rendered.
Which is
Right. So it's happening in there. This is the copy that I just made.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it can't be the project. Unless you've been jumping through files doing weird stuff.
No, I just looked on the new.
Gotta be something about set up your machine. That gem. Maybe your RPM install. Just try typing RPM. See what that does. Try typing RPM list. Install. Oh, you're using Ruby 2. That could be a part of it. That definitely could be a part of what's going on here. You're on a whole different version of Ruby.
Oh. How do I go back to Ruby 1.8?
It says it's not even installed. When you do RPM list, it lists all of the Rubies you have installed, so you'll actually have to reinstall 193. So you would do RPM install Ruby hyphen 193. This will probably take a bit.
And it needs to be done.
Then you can say RPM use.
Ruby use Ruby dash 1.3.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then run from there.
But we know they changed a lot in Ruby too.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely some differences. Yeah, probably what's happening is my project is requiring some gems that are not compatible with Ruby 2.0. So it
And if I want to delete 2, do I just do already delete Ruby -2 prime?
I think, but there's nothing actually wrong with having both.
Error running make. Just have a class for you.
Yeah, we are. Either way. Okay. All right. I'm not sure what that is. I might have to search for that one.
Okay. Let's see, so where are we? I think that's pretty much it for drawing up the code. Talked about helpers, talked about partials. Did you have any questions about any of those? Okay. That is certainly not everything in the world there is to know about Rails views, but it's certainly, hopefully, a decent foundation. Give you enough of an idea of where different things are and some of the different things that are possible. There's lots of other methods primarily, lots of other helpers that we haven't talked about, but those are all pretty well documented, so can be looked up fairly easily. So unless you have any specific questions, I think that's what we needed to talk about views, and we're ready to go on and start talking about the controller. Yeah? All right. Hey, this is super. Halfway through the semester, and we're finally to the third part. Right? So we've talked about models, we've talked about views, we've talked about MV. The only thing we have left then is C, the controllers. Right? So C is the controllers and MVC. Right? Basically, the controllers are important because the controller acts sort of like the glue that ties everything else together. The controller is what usually is used to fetch data from the models. The controller is what usually decides what views should actually be shown. The controller is what actually accepts input from the user. Right? The controller is just kind of always right there in the middle of everything, making sure that all of the other parts get pulled together in a way that they make the job get done that we want to get done. Right? So let's be done with lightsabers. As a matter of fact, being done with lightsabers might help out with that problem. You can keep working in 2, and hopefully things will kind of go back on track a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to go and quit out of this lightsabers project. Let me jump back up to my desktop and let me start a new project. I'm going to say Rails new, and I guess I'll just call it controller example. There we go. Controller example. Let me go ahead and open that up in my editor. Don't need the server running quite yet, not for the moment. First thing I wanted to do is go look under the controllers directory that's created for us automatically. Even though all we have done at this point is create a empty project shell. Right? We don't have any models, we don't have any views, we don't have anything specific going on inside of it right now. There is still a single controller that's already there for us called application controller. Every Rails application has an application controller. Application controller inherits from application base, which is fundamentally where all controllers get all of their basic functionality. Okay. There's a method or two that typically get called from inside the controller, the application controller, like protect from forgery there, which basically is one half of the process of automatically protecting forms from cross-site forgery, right? Having somebody else put a form on their site and submit to our server, essentially. Right? But that's always there. Every other controller we then create is automatically going to inherit from application controller. So we basically end up with a situation where application controller is sort of the base class, and every other controller we create then inherits from application controller. So whenever we want to add functionality, an action, to a specific controller, we just put that action into that specific controller. But application controller is always here to be sort of an umbrella, where when there is ever anything that we want to become a part of every controller throughout the whole project, all we have to do is take that thing, put it here inside application controller, and since all the other controllers inherit from it, that method that was added to application controller will then become available throughout the entire project. Okay? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add another controller. Okay? Back out on the console, I'm going to do Rails G controller. Tell it I want to generate a new controller. I'm going to tell it I want my new controller to be called items. Okay. When I hit enter, it goes ahead and generates that controller for me. It actually names it items_controller.rb, puts it there into my controllers folder. It also then created a views folder and a handful of other files that go along with it. Okay. If I take a look at my items controller, you can see, like I was saying a second ago, that it actually does inherit from application controller. So anything that's an application controller, items controller automatically gets access to as well. So just like the application controller has the protect from forgery in it, all of my items then will have protect from forgery automatically in them. Okay. Seem okay so far? All right. When I created items controller here under the views folder, it automatically created an items views folder, right? But currently there are no actual files in it. If I wanted to speed up the process of actually creating some views to go along with this controller, when I generate the controller on the command line, instead of simply giving it a controller name, like I did here, I could instead also specify the name of some views I want. So let's tell it we want an index, a show, a new, and an edit action. Right? Any actions that you specify when you generate a new controller this way, since we already created an items controller, it's going to ask if we want to override it. I'm just going to hit the enter key for yes. Okay. It also asks if I want to override a few other files. I'm just going to say yes, override it all. Okay, when we generate a controller and we specify actions, right, it's going to do a couple of things for us. One of those things is it automatically fills in the little stubs of those methods in the controller for me. So my items controller that was completely blank a minute ago now has these little blank methods in it for the 4 different actions that I asked for: index, show, new, and edit. It also then, under the views folder, went ahead and created little stub HTML ERB files for me. So I've got the beginning of my view files so that I don't have to actually go and create those files by hand. So just a little bit of a convenience is really all that is. Now, overall, the basic idea with these actions is that they will correspond to particular URLs. So when the user of our web application types in a particular URL, the URL will correspond to executing a particular action in a particular controller. So, for example, if they wanted to execute the new action of the items controller, they would do something like /items/new as the path. Right? So that basically then constitutes sort of the input, in that case, coming from the user that would cause the new action to actually execute. Generally, what a controller's responsibility to do is to take the user's input and, based on what it is, go ahead and make any manipulations or requests for data that are required. Right? After it's actually requested or manipulated whatever data needs to be done, right? Done anything with the data, with the models that need to be done, the next thing the controller almost always then does is decide how to respond to the user. The responses pretty much always take the form of rendering a view of one sort or another. Okay? So, like I said before, the controller is always sort of sitting there in the middle. A request comes in from a user. Based on the request, right, the controller figures out what it needs to do with the models. Once whatever needs to be done with the models is done, it then picks a view to show. Right? So, really, to kind of get an idea of what we should fill into the different actions here of our controller, what we need is some data to work with. We need an active record model to go along with this controller. Okay? So before we fill anything else in there, let's go create a controller. I'm sorry, a model. Blech. I'm hungry. Not thinking so good. I'm going to say Rails generate model item. And let's say that every item has a name and a speed. Nothing fancy, no relations really. Just a single model that will have some data to work with. So that we'll have some data to work with. I'll go ahead and generate that model. Let me go ahead and migrate my database. There we go. And I wasn't going to put the forms together for creating these new items immediately, so for just a moment, let's go ahead and go into the console and just fill in some data so we have something to look at. When I jump into the console here, if I take a look, it knows what an item is. So let me just say item create a new item whose name is can of beans, and whose speed is very slow. I'll create another item. Let's do a conch shell, whose speed is, let's just say, slow. There's that one. I think next I'll create a spoon, whose speed is very slow. And then last but not least, a sock. Dirty sock, whose speed is very slow. There we go. If I say item.all, I should see all 4 of my items in there. Kind of hard to see, I don't have HIRB installed. Item.count though shows yes, I have 4 items. Okay, so now I've got 4 items. Alright, once that's done, let me go ahead and start up my server. I'm going to say Rails S, get the server running. There we go. If I head over to my browser, if I just go to localhost 3000, I get my standard little welcome page. If I go to localhost 3000/items, however, it says it doesn't even know what items are. That's a routing problem. Let's go take a look at our routes file. Under the config directory, routes.rb. Oh, I see what the deal is. Up at the top of your routes file, it should have put in default routes for the different actions we requested. So for index, show, new, and edit. Right? Those were put in for us automatically when we generated our controller and told it those were the actions we wanted. Right? So you'd think it would know what items is, but what it's looking for is these strings specifically, items/index. So in my browser, I can't just go to generic items, but if I go to items/index, then it works. So that's okay, we can work with that for right now. Oops, didn't mean that. Okay, so if I go to items/index, we're actually pulling up the index view. Let's see. Here's my index view. Right? Same thing. You with me? Okay. Now, what I actually want the index view to do is I want it to be able to display all of the items for me. So what the controller's responsibility becomes is to get the data that the view needs, right, to be able to display what it's supposed to display. So if the index view needs to be able to display all the items, the controller index action needs to provide all the items. So what I could do is I could make an instance variable here in the index method, items. And to get all the items, I could of course just say item.all, just like we would do in the console. And because I'm taking this collection of items and I'm putting them into an instance variable, instance variables automatically become available to the view. So essentially, whenever a controller wants to take something and make it accessible to a view, all it really needs to do is put it in an instance variable. Instance variables become sort of global, if you want to think of them that way. Right? So over on my index page then, if I were to say there are pluralize at item.count item, then on my index page now, oops, oh, items, sorry, that should be at items, plural. There. Now on my index page it comes up and says there are 4 items. And I can do whatever it is that I normally would do in a view with that data now. Maybe I just want to print them out. Let's see, we could say add items, each do item. Maybe I'll put this in a ordered list. For each item then is a list item. I'll say link to the item's name. Oh, actually, let's not do a link to yet. I'll just do the item's name is, and then maybe I'll do the item speed. If I take a look at that in the browser, I get there are 4 items. Can of beans is very slow, conch shell is slow, so on and so forth. I guess in my view I could go ahead and get rid of that default boilerplate stuff up at the top. Doesn't really need to be there anymore, does it? Yeah. So overall the idea was input came in from the user, a request in this case, asking to see a list of all the items. The user requested that by putting in the correct path to get to the index page, which generally should show a list or a collection of items. The controller then was automatically called, this action executed, and the controller's job was to gather up the data that was needed. So it did that by using ActiveRecord, doing item.all, and then it hands that data off to the view by taking that data and putting it into an instance variable. Right? In this particular case then, we didn't have to say specifically which view to use. Instead, we just kind of fell back on Rails' default of the fact that if we go to the index action in the controller, it will automatically render, if we don't say otherwise, the file, the view file called index. Right? So that all kind of happened for us automatically, and now when we go to item/index, we end up seeing a list of the items like we would hopefully expect. So let's say then we wanted to be able to go to a detail page about each one of these items. What I want to do is I want to take the name of the item and I want to turn it into a hyperlink. So I'm going to say link to the item, and I'll pass the item itself as a second argument. Oh, actually can't do that here because the way the router is set up again. Getting an error says undefined method item path. Right? Instead, I guess we're going to have to do a set of curly braces there, and we can say controller items. Actually, we don't even need that part. Shouldn't need that part. Let's just say action show ID item. Let's see if that works. Yes. So essentially putting together this link here without the benefit of any of the fancy routing stuff that Rails does, what I'm doing is I'm telling it, stay in the controller we're already in, basically the items controller. Since with this hyperlink I didn't tell it any different controller, it will just make that assumption that we're going to stay in the items controller. I'm telling it that I want this link to go to the show action. Right? So the action here called show is basically where I'm wanting to end up. And because the show action is meant to show details about a single item, the show action is going to need to know the ID of that item. So that's why I put the second part there with the link to, where I specified the ID for this item, essentially. Right? That creates these hyperlinks for me. If I inspect one, we can see that it comes out /item/show, and then a URL parameter of ID equals 1 for can of beans, 2 for conch shell, so on and so forth. Okay. And if I actually click on one of the links, it does take me over to the show page. So before we actually play with the show page itself, we need to address what happens in the controller. Because when we actually click one of those hyperlinks, it's actually the controller action that we reach first. We execute the show action in the items controller before we ever go and touch the show view file. Because of course the show action is going to need to find the particular item that the page is supposed to show before it then hands that item off to the actual view file to display. So how does the show file actually do that? Right? We can of course do item.find to get a particular item. But where do we then get the ID? How do we retrieve the ID from the URL that was passed on by that link that we clicked? Right? Well, it turns out that there is a nice little hash called params. This params hash automatically has stored in it any values that are passed as get or post parameters. So any extra values that are a part of the URL or any values that are submitted as form values all automatically become a part of this params hash. Matter of fact, we could look at it if we say render text params ID, or even better, let's just say render text params.inspect. Okay. Now whenever I try and go to the show, it doesn't even use my show view file. It's weird, got mice or something back there, I guess. It doesn't even use the show view file because we're telling the controller specifically what to send back. We're saying specifically render this text. Right? So in this case, it's running an inspect on that hash so that we can actually see what's in it. So here in this case where I clicked on my first item, I can see that the ID is stored there in the params hash along with the current name of the controller and the current action that's executing. If I come over and I click on spoon, then I can see the ID of 3 is stored there, name of the controller, name of the action. So that params hash always has in it the information that we need. In this case, all we really need is the ID. So if I were to say just params ID, use ID as the key for that hash, then whenever I click on one of my items, I can just get the ID for that particular item. Which means I can use params ID then to retrieve that particular item. I could do something like say item.find params ID. That'll grab the one item that goes along with the link that was just clicked. And to hand it off to the view then, I can just put it into an instance variable. So if I say add item equals item.find an item that has the ID that just came in as part of the hyperlink, then we should be at that point retrieving the particular item that the user has made a request for. right? I took out the render statement, which means we're now going to fall back to actually using the show view file. So here in the show view file, up here for the header, if I put in @item.name for the description, or for the paragraph here, I'll do @item.speed. Now if I click on can of beans, it takes me to a page that shows me details about can of beans, specifically the show page for that item. If I click on spoon, seems to work just fine. Okay? So communicating through the controller. Request from the user is interpreted, leads to a controller action. Controller action at this point is retrieving data that's necessary to render the views. It then hands off to the views through the use of an instance variable or instance variables if necessary, so that the view can then be rendered and sent back to the user as a response, right? An answer to their question. Not bad. There's lots of other things we can do inside view actions, but that's probably where we ought to stop for today. Seem okay? All right. Were there any last questions? All right. We will pick up again on Wednesday. Hope you have a good afternoon.